Hello, family. This is part 2 of the previous story. In case you missed part 1, check our channel. Here's the summary of part 1. Maxwell Cole, a wealthy Nigerian businessman obsessed with legacy and status, is enraged when his wife Agnes Nwoke gives birth to a daughter instead of the son he desperately wanted. In a moment of heartless calculation, he drives the newborn to the sea on a stormy night and throws her into the water from a remote cliff, believing no one is watching. Unbeknownst to him, a kind-hearted couple, Angela and Tony Obi, witness the horrific act from afar and rush to rescue the infant. Miraculously, the child survives. The Obis, who have struggled with infertility, take the baby in as their own and name her Blossom. To avoid suspicion, Angela and Tony lie to authorities and say the baby was abandoned on their doorstep. Meanwhile, Agnes is told her baby has died. Grief-stricken and broken by Maxwell's cold indifference, she disappears from public life. The Obis raise Blossom with love in a quiet coastal town. As she grows, Blossom begins to ask questions about her origin, especially when she notices she doesn't look like her parents. The Obis dodge the truth, hoping to protect her. Blossom's moral compass sharpens through childhood as she stands up to bullies and challenges injustice. At age 11, she stumbles upon an old newspaper clipping hidden in storage, a story involving Maxwell Cole. Though she doesn't yet understand the connection, the name lodges in her memory. At 13, she discovers a scorched birth certificate and a baby blanket, confirming she was adopted. Angela eventually breaks down and tells her the truth. Fueled by both a desire to understand her past and a growing sense of justice, Blossom pursues law. With her parents' sacrifice and encouragement, she earns her place in law school. There, she sees Maxwell Cole, now a famous philanthropist, on the news, which ignites something deep within her. She later becomes a protege to the wise Judge Miriam Ayes, who sees her potential. Blossom rises through the legal system and is eventually appointed as a judge. When an anonymous file lands on her desk containing evidence of embezzlement and fraud tied to Maxwell's empire, she takes the case without revealing her connection. As the trial unfolds, Blossom reconnects with her birth mother, Agnes, and the emotional reunion is tender but restrained. Nathan Cole, Maxwell's son, begins to suspect the truth as the case grows more damning. In the trial's climax, Blossom delivers the final blow. She reveals her true identity as the daughter Maxwell tried to kill. The courtroom erupts. Maxwell is publicly disgraced, arrested, and his empire collapses. Nathan walks away in disbelief. Blossom embraces both her families, Angela and Tony, Agnes and her history, and finds peace in her role as a symbol of justice. Part 1 ends with Blossom mentoring young law students, one of whom reminds her of herself. She smiles, ready to pass on the torch. The baby once discarded returns as a force for truth. Her name is Blossom, and she chose justice. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Agnes Nwoke sat in the faded cane chair of her countryside veranda, her hands trembling slightly as she poured Blossom Obi a cup of tea. The air was hushed, the distant sound of birdsong, the only thing stirring between them. Blossom, now respected as Judge Obi, watched the older woman with guarded curiosity. Agnes had asked for a private visit, no cameras, no questions, just truth. After a long silence, Agnes spoke, her voice brittle. Before I disappeared, before I gave up everything, I had another child. Blossom sat up. Another, Agnes nodded slowly, her eyes glossy with unspilled tears. After your father left me in disgrace, I had a brief relationship out of pain, not love. The woman was fragile. She died giving birth. Her throat caught. The child, a girl, was taken into state care. I was too broken to fight. I called her Hope. Blossom's hands clutched the ceramic mug, growing cold in her palms. Where is she now? Agnes hesitated. I don't know, I've tried, but she was raised in a home. She doesn't know me. Doesn't know you. But she saw the trial. She's seen you. Blossom's mind reeled. A sister. A ghost she never knew she'd been missing. Agnes's voice broke the silence again, but softer this time and laced with dread. She isn't like you, Blossom. She wasn't loved. She didn't have Angela and Tony. Her eyes, they carry something I've seen in Maxwell's. That same rage, that coldness. Blossom stood slowly, stunned by the weight of the revelation. The image of her father throwing her into the sea flashed again. But now, she wasn't the only one left floating in the dark. She swallowed hard, heart pounding. I need to find her. Agnes reached for her hand, voice trembling. If you do, be careful. She's not seeking justice, Blossom. She's seeking someone to blame. Hope sat on the edge of a worn metal bunk bed inside the faded brick walls of St. Gertrude's orphanage, the distant hum of the city leaking through cracked windows. Her eyes stayed fixed on a muted TV screen mounted above the dining hall, where a news clip replayed footage from Blossom Obie's courtroom. The judge's voice echoed in the room as captions scrolled beneath. He threw me into the sea, and the sea returned me. Around her, children chattered and ran with plates. But Hope's world narrowed to that sentence. She didn't blink. Her breath quickened. Her fingers tightened around a chipped cup of tea. She hadn't known where she came from for years, only fragments, whispers from nurses who pitied her. But this woman had answers, and she was everywhere. They love her, Hope murmured. Her voice cracked under the weight of bitterness. But I bled too. In the privacy of her room, she dug out a shoebox wrapped in a tattered scarf. Inside were old intake papers from the orphanage, faint names scribbled in blue ink. Mother, unknown. Relative, Agnes Nwoke. Hope stared at the name, her jaw clenched. She'd written to this Agnes once. No reply. No explanation. Only silence. Now she realized why. She had another daughter. One she spoke to, sat with, cried for. One the world adored. Her blood boiled with confusion and rejection. She looked at the mirror across the room and muttered, "She took what could have been mine." Her reflection stared back with glassy eyes, dark and seething. Blossom Obie, Hope Cole is coming. She began scribbling in a notebook questions, timelines, phrases. She didn't know how this would unfold, but she knew one thing for certain. She would no longer be the forgotten girl. She would write herself into the legacy they all tried to erase, whether they wanted her or not. Blossom walked into her chambers one humid afternoon, the scent of rain still clinging to her robes, when she found Samuel Nduka seated quietly by her desk. His brow was furrowed, a folded document in hand. "I didn't call you for court gossip," he said softly, placing the envelope in front of her. "You've been served, Blossom." Her throat tightened as she opened it, an official civil suit filed by one Hope Cole. The accusation was chilling: identity fraud, emotional theft, and public defamation. Blossom's heart thudded violently against her chest. "She's not just angry," Samuel added. "She's methodical. This wasn't a spontaneous cry for help. She wants to destroy everything you've built." Blossom rose, pacing slowly, her fingers trailing the edge of her mahogany desk. "How did she find me?" she whispered. "Why now?" Samuel shook his head. "She's been watching longer than you think. You became the symbol, and she became the shadow." Later that night, Blossom stood in Angela's kitchen, turning the letter over in her hands. Tony sat beside her, his cane resting against the chair, aged but alert. Angela sighed deeply as Blossom read the document aloud. "She's not suing for money," Blossom said, voice low. "She's suing for recognition, for the right to be seen." Angela's eyes watered, her voice tender. "You were both thrown away, Blossom, but she landed without a net." Tony rubbed his hands together. "Don't let this make you enemies. Try to see her." Blossom looked up sharply. "She sued me, Papa." But his eyes didn't flinch. Sometimes the loudest cries for love sound like war. Silence stretched across the kitchen. Finally, Blossom folded the letter neatly and tucked it into her file. "Then let's go to battle with eyes open." Her voice didn't shake, but in her soul, ghosts stirred again, ghosts not from the sea, but from blood. The musty walls of Maxwell Cole's prison cell were lined with aged books, ink-stained notes, and a small transistor radio buzzing with distant trial updates. The moment he heard the name Hope Cole on the station, he froze. He turned the volume up, his spine straightening with interest. A low chuckle escaped his throat, curling into a whisper. "Another one. The sea spits them out like curses." He sat on the edge of his cot and began writing furiously, his handwriting jagged with impatience. The letter was to Nathan. Its contents were clear, chilling, and calculated. "Your sisters are hungry. They will consume everything I built. Blossom pretends to be holy. Hope pretends to be hurt. Don't let them fool you. Protect what is yours." The paper soaked in his venom like a sponge. He sealed it with trembling fingers, eyes dark with obsession. Let them fight. Let them tear each other apart. When Nathan Cole received the letter, he was in his private office, reviewing philanthropic project budgets. He read it once, then again, and a third time slower. Maxwell's tone, manipulative yet fatherly, struck an old nerve. They're ungrateful girls who don't know their place. You're the heir. Don't be fooled by their tears. Nathan dropped the letter onto the desk, leaning back, mind spiraling. That night he called Blossom. Her voice was calm, cautious. "Nathan, you all right?" He paused. "Do you think Hope is your real sister?" Blossom hesitated. "I don't know yet." "Why?" Nathan's voice changed. "Because I'm not going to let you all take everything my father built." The line went dead. Blossom stared at her phone, heart sinking. Across town, Maxwell sat in silence, a grin twitching at the corners of his mouth. The seeds had been planted, and the rot had begun to spread. Nathan Cole's face lit up the screen of every legal blog by morning. His statement splashed across headlines like wildfire. The legacy of the Cole family must not be dragged through the mud of drama. In the interview, his tone was calm, but laced with veiled disdain. Blossom watched the clip on mute from her office, her gaze unreadable. "He's turning this into a spectacle," murmured Samuel as he entered with a thick folder. Blossom closed the laptop, her fingers trembling slightly. "He thinks I'm out to ruin his inheritance. He's not even asking why." Samuel sat beside her, placing a hand gently over hers. "This isn't about facts anymore, Blossom. He's trying to protect the only piece of your father he still respects." Blossom turned to the window, her voice soft but pained. "He used to call me sister. Now I'm a threat with a title." Later that evening, Hope sat across from a smirking TV anchor, her expression shifting between conviction and volatility. "Blossom wasn't the only one abandoned," she snapped. "Yet she walks in robes while I sit in shadows. Where's the justice in that?" The anchor leaned in, prodding gently. "Do you believe she wronged you personally?" Hope didn't flinch. She made herself the only story worth hearing. The rest of us were silenced. The interview aired on prime time, stirring fierce debates online. Comments poured in. Is Hope jealous? Or does she deserve space too? The public split like glass under pressure. Angela turned off the television with a weary sigh. "This will get uglier before it gets better," she whispered. Blossom remained composed, but inside, a rift widened, not just between her and Hope, but between truth and perception. Nathan's words, Hope's fury, and Maxwell's shadow coiled into a storm that no courtroom could calm. Nathan stood before a panel of trustees, voice crisp, suit immaculate, yet his eyes betrayed fatigue. "I'm petitioning that any residual wealth, trusts, or real estate attached to Maxwell Cole be legally protected from fraudulent claimants," he stated. The language was precise, the tone professional. But Blossom, seated quietly at the back of the hearing, felt each syllable like a slap. He was drawing lines in concrete, lines she was never meant to cross. The room buzzed with murmurs as his motion was received for review. Afterward, she confronted him outside beneath the courthouse steps, rain threatening above. "You could have called," she said simply. Nathan didn't meet her eyes. "I don't owe you explanations, Blossom. I owe my father a legacy." She didn't blink. "A legacy built on silence and blood. You're clinging to the ashes of a man who threw us away." Nathan turned his back and walked toward his car, soaked in pride. The damage wasn't just emotional. It spread through whispers in court circles, academic conferences, even alumni groups. Rumors of Blossom exploiting sympathy to build her judicial career began surfacing, echoing Nathan's carefully seeded accusations. At her foundation, calls dropped. Donors pulled back quietly. Even students at the law institute she sponsored began whispering her name like it was tainted. In the quiet of her home, Blossom removed her judge's robe and held it in her lap. Angela brought her tea and knelt beside her. "I've seen storms, baby, but don't let this one blind you. You were born in water, but you didn't drown. You became the current." Blossom nodded, but her hands trembled. Meanwhile, Nathan, behind closed doors, snapped at assistants, drank through meetings, and ignored Samuel's calls. The poison Maxwell mailed into his mind had not only taken root, it had begun to devour everything steady in his life. But no one could reach him. Not yet. The airport's glass doors parted, and David Obie stepped into the humid Lagos morning, rolling his briefcase beside him, eyes sharp behind black-rimmed frames. A junior partner now in a UK-based law firm, he hadn't planned to return for another year. But Blossom's message, just one line, "It's all unraveling," had pulled him home. That evening, he sat across from Nathan in a penthouse bar, where the skyline glittered in soft blue. "I came here to talk, not to judge," David began, sipping slowly. Nathan leaned back, defensive. "Then you can start by understanding I'm not the villain here." David placed a hand flat on the table. "I know you're not, but you're doing the devil's bidding without realizing it." Nathan scowled. "You think Blossom's innocent?" David nodded. "I think you're both bleeding, but you're stabbing the only person still willing to call you brother." Nathan stood, slamming his glass down. "We're not family." The next day, David visited Blossom and Angela at home. The reunion was tight with emotion, Angela hugging him fiercely, her tears silent. "I wish your father could see you now," she whispered. Blossom took him aside. "I'm losing him, David. It's like Maxwell wrote the script, and Nathan is reading it word for word." David sat with her late into the night, outlining possible legal angles, reputation management, and evidence strategy. But more than that, he gave her back her breath. "He'll come around, but not through pressure," David said. "He needs truth, but more than that, he needs a reason to remember who he was before Maxwell became a god in his eyes." Meanwhile, Hope's rising media presence was beginning to backfire. In interviews, her tone grew accusatory, then hostile. Comments shifted. "She sounds unstable. Something's off." Hope sensed the change. But her rage was a fire that had gone too far to be smothered now. Not without something breaking. Nathan's arrest came like a thunderclap in broad daylight. Corruption allegations linked to one of Maxwell's dormant offshore foundations dragged him into an ugly investigation. The news broke as a quiet scroll beneath a morning broadcast, but by afternoon, his face was everywhere. Blossom sat in silence at her desk, her phone buzzing incessantly. "He didn't even call me," she muttered. Angela walked in with a paper in hand. "He's ashamed," she said softly. "He should be." Samuel chimed in from the doorway, but that doesn't mean he should face this alone. Hours passed before David received the call, Nathan's voice rough and low. "I need help." Within 24 hours, Blossom, David, and Samuel were seated across from him in a concrete interview room. His shoulders slumped, eyes bloodshot. "I messed everything up," he whispered. Blossom met his gaze for the first time in weeks. "You didn't mess everything up, but it's time to start cleaning." In the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Blossom was no longer the judge, but the advocate, sharp, strategic, but visibly burdened. Samuel handled the financial documents. David tackled procedural flaws, and Blossom addressed the courtroom with poise that masked personal betrayal. "Mr. Cole was not the architect of this fraud," she stated clearly. "He was its inheritor, unwitting, pressured, and used." The judge leaned forward. "And do you have proof of this?" David rose, producing the signed ledgers from Maxwell's prison correspondence, damning Nathan without even naming him directly. The courtroom hushed as the evidence played out. Nathan sat motionless, barely breathing. After the session, Samuel found him outside, shaking. "Why are you here?" Nathan asked. "You could have left me to drown." Samuel folded his arms. "Because we don't abandon family, even when they're covered in mud." Nathan stared at him, then looked toward Blossom, who waited by the steps, arms crossed but open. In that moment, something fractured within him finally gave way, not in defeat, but surrender. The judge's verdict fell with solemn weight. Not guilty. Nathan stood slowly as murmurs filled the gallery, a surreal hush blanketing the room. He looked toward the table where Blossom, David, and Samuel sat, worn but dignified, and bowed his head in deep remorse. At the post-trial press briefing, cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and the world waited for a statement. Nathan cleared his throat, his voice steady but raw. "I let bitterness speak louder than memory. I let a ghost shape how I treated the only family I have left." He paused, glancing toward Blossom. "That hate isn't heritage, and I refuse to pass down my father's poison." Blossom, standing nearby, blinked hard against rising tears. The crowd erupted in applause, not for the acquittal, but for the transformation. Hope, watching from an apartment far away, slammed her glass onto the table. He was supposed to destroy her, not stand beside her, she muttered, trembling. That evening, a quiet dinner was held in Blossom's home. Angela prepared jollof rice and grilled fish, the aroma floating like forgiveness through the air. David poured drinks. Samuel lit candles on the veranda. Nathan sat awkwardly at first, eyes flickering between them all, but slowly his posture softened. "Do you remember the time Dad took us to the lagoon and left us there for 3 hours because we talked back?" he said, chuckling under his breath. Blossom raised an eyebrow. That wasn't a trip. That was abandonment with scenic views. Laughter broke through like sunlight. Nathan looked at her and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." Blossom placed a hand on his. "Thank yourself. You walked back." Later, as night deepened, Samuel stood beside Blossom as they watched the stars emerge. "You were right," he murmured. "Love is louder than legacy." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It has to be. Otherwise, what's left?" In the quiet, beneath that healing night sky, a broken family began to stitch itself whole again, thread by honest thread. The prison smelled of iron and dust, thick with the weight of decaying time. Nathan walked down the corridor in silence, each step echoing like a verdict. Inmates stared through bars, but none dared speak. When he reached the final chamber, Maxwell was seated on a wooden bench reading a torn newspaper, his back straight, his eyes sharp despite age and isolation. "Well, well," Maxwell said without looking up. "The prodigal son returns." Nathan remained standing, arms crossed. "I didn't come for a reunion." Maxwell folded the paper with precision, rising to his feet. "Then what did you come for? An apology?" he sneered. "You won't get it. I did what I had to." Nathan shook his head. "You poisoned everything you touched. Even when they loved you, you couldn't stand it." Maxwell's smile faded. "They were weak." Nathan stepped forward, voice low. "No, they were human. You just never learned how to be." For the first time in his life, Maxwell Cole looked small, cornered not by bars, but by truth. "They'll forget me," he muttered. "They'll erase my name." Nathan's eyes narrowed. "They already have." He turned and walked away. Maxwell called after him, voice rising. "I made you. All of you." Nathan never looked back. Outside, the light stung his eyes, but the air felt free. He exhaled deeply. That chapter was over. At home, he entered Blossom's kitchen without knocking. "He's dead to me," he said simply. Blossom looked up from the sink, dried her hands, and pulled him into a quiet sibling embrace. "Then we can finally live." In that hug, there were no words about legacy, no mention of bloodlines, just two survivors choosing healing over hate. As for Maxwell, his name would remain buried, even before death. Forgotten by those he wounded, remembered only as a warning. Power without love is ruin. The letter came with no fanfare, just a plain envelope slipped under Blossom's office door, but its contents were anything but ordinary. Inside was a formal summons. Hope was suing her again, this time not as a sister but as a public figure, accusing Blossom of emotional sabotage, character misrepresentation, and identity theft. The claims were brutal. She capitalized on pain that wasn't solely hers, the suit read. She paraded herself as the only wounded daughter of Maxwell Cole, rendering the rest of us invisible. Blossom read it twice without blinking, her heart steady, her mind already unfolding the implications. Samuel sat across from her in their office, leaning back with a tired sigh. "She's grasping at shadows now, but legally you have to respond." Blossom looked out the window. "No, I have to understand." Angela, walking in with a tray of tea, caught the mood and sat down quietly. "Is it anger or grief talking?" Blossom whispered, more to herself than anyone. The press got hold of the lawsuit within 48 hours, and chaos bloomed again. News anchors and bloggers debated whether Blossom had overshadowed others with similar traumas, people who didn't have a courtroom or robe to speak from. In a painful twist, Hope's interview aired on a primetime special. Dressed in a somber blue blouse, she spoke with measured poise. "I'm not jealous," she said. "I'm invisible." She made sure of it. Blossom sat in her living room, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes, unmoving. Nathan turned off the television with a hard snap. "This is manipulation," he said. "She knows what she's doing." But Blossom shook her head. "What if it's just the only way she knows how to scream? David entered moments later, fresh from a strategy meeting. We can countersue for defamation, false claims, reputational harm. No, Blossom interrupted. Let her speak. If she's still bleeding, we won't silence her again. Silence settled like dust in the room. Samuel finally asked, Then what will you do? Blossom stared ahead, calm and resolute. I'll give her the room I never had to tell her story, even if it burns mine. Just as the court began preliminary hearings for Hope's lawsuit, a bombshell cracked the public stage. A third woman appeared, claiming to be another daughter of Maxwell Cole. Her name was Grace Aduba, a social worker with a paper trail of orphanages and foster homes tracing back decades. She held up photos, DNA tests, even a bracelet allegedly inscribed with Maxwell's initials. Her tone wasn't broken like Hope's or quiet like Blossom's, it was ferocious. He didn't just abandon me, she snapped during a live interview. He erased me, and I will not remain forgotten. The media exploded with headlines like, Daughters of the Sea multiply, and Maxwell's bloodline continues to haunt the nation. Blossom watched from her office, stunned. Is this true? She asked Samuel, who was already on the phone with investigative contacts. Too many gaps, too convenient, he said. But if she's lying, she's got a damn good story. Hope's fury intensified. Rather than aligning with Grace as a fellow abandoned child, she reacted with venom. She's a fraud, Hope told the press. I don't know where she crawled out from, but she's exploiting our tragedy. Grace shot back the next day. Funny, I said the same thing about you. It became a public feud, sparking talk shows, podcasts, hashtags. Blossom, meanwhile, said nothing. She walked the line between legal obligation and personal heartbreak, watching two storms clash while trying not to get caught in the thunder. David suggested issuing a statement of neutrality. You can't be the lighthouse for every drifting boat, he cautioned. I'm not trying to be, Blossom replied, but if I throw a stone now, I'll drown us all. In private, Blossom reached out to Agnes. The old woman listened to Grace's interviews and quietly said, That voice. It's not your sister's. It's someone else's hurt pretending to belong. Still, Blossom waited, searching not for proof, but for motive. Why now? She whispered one evening. And what does she think this will fix? The pressure fractured Hope like thin glass under constant heat. Her social media turned erratic. Once thoughtful posts now spiked with accusations, conspiracy theories, and wild claims. She accused Blossom of bribing judges, claimed Grace was a paid actress hired to distract from Blossom's rise, and even suggested Angela and Tony were complicit in a massive cover-up. The more outlandish the claims became, the more public sympathy slipped through her fingers. But behind the spectacle was a real woman unraveling. Agnes showed up unannounced one rainy morning at the shelter where Hope had recently moved. You shouldn't have come, Hope said, voice sharp but eyes weary. Agnes stepped inside anyway, soaked and trembling. I didn't come to lecture. I came to tell you. I never stopped looking for you. And when I couldn't find you, I prayed someone else would. Hope stared at her, expression unreadable. Then why do I still feel like I'm drowning? Agnes reached into her bag and pulled out a faded photograph, a woman with Hope's eyes, holding a baby. Your mother. She named you Hope because that's all she had left. For a second, Hope's breath caught, but she blinked it away, hardening again. And yet somehow I ended up alone. Agnes nodded, voice cracking. Alone doesn't mean unloved. The words hung in the damp air, both fragile and heavy. Hope's hands trembled as she took the photo. I don't know who I am anymore, she admitted. Agnes stepped closer. You're not her. Not me. Not even him. You're you. And that's enough if you let it be. Tears spilled then, but Hope didn't allow herself to sob. Just a single bitter drop sliding down her cheek. Agnes pulled her into a hesitant hug, not tight but honest. That night, Hope posted nothing. No interviews, no rants. Just silence, and silence for once spoke more loudly than chaos. The courtroom was packed that morning, not with press or protesters, but with murmuring curiosity and watchful uncertainty. Blossom stood behind the podium, facing the panel of judges set to deliberate on the final stage of Hope's case. But what came next stunned the entire gallery. Instead of filing a defense argument or launching a counterattack, Blossom rose quietly, hands steady, voice calm. Your honors, I am withdrawing my response. Gasps rippled. Even Samuel, seated near the front, stood slightly in disbelief. I ask only that this court allow for mediation, not for legal gain, but for peace. The lead judge blinked slowly, as if trying to decode her intent. Are you saying you're conceding guilt? Blossom shook her head. I am saying this case isn't about guilt. It's about healing. And sometimes the courtroom is not the right vessel for that. Cameras snapped. Whispers grew louder. Hope sat across the aisle, lips slightly parted, unsure whether this was strategy or surrender. Later that day, in the courthouse's private mediation chamber, Hope and Blossom faced each other without legal teams, microphones, or protective barriers. No Gabel. Just silence. Blossom folded her hands on the table. This isn't about who deserves to be heard more. It's about the damage silence does when it pretends to protect. Hope scoffed. You think this makes you noble? Blossom shook her head again. No, it makes me accountable. A long pause. Hope leaned forward slightly. You took everything. My face in the world, my right to rage. And now you're trying to take my anger, too. Blossom's voice softened. I never took your rage. I just refused to echo it. Something in Hope's expression shifted, less guarded, more tired. Blossom continued. We may have shared a father, but we didn't share a childhood. That's not your fault, but it's not mine either. The tension hovered like static between them, not dissipated, but no longer suffocating. After what felt like a suspended lifetime, Hope muttered, What now? Blossom gave the gentlest answer of her life. We don't have to be sisters, but we don't have to be enemies either. No news outlet was granted entry. No court transcript was released. The verdict, if it could be called that, was delivered in silence. Hope dropped her lawsuit in exchange for a quiet financial settlement and joint acknowledgement of their shared paternity. There were no headlines, just a statement issued through both their representatives. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's choosing peace over punishment. The legal world murmured about missed opportunities, speculated about behind-the-scenes pressure, and framed it as Blossom retreating under public scrutiny. But those closest to her knew it was something else entirely. In her chambers that evening, Samuel handed her a stack of unopened letters from community members, mostly women, who had once been abandoned or silenced. They don't care who won, he said, setting them gently beside her. They care that you stood tall enough not to strike back. Hope left the city 2 days later. The press trailed her this time. No live streams documented her departure. Only Agnes saw her off at the train station, pressing a paper-wrapped sandwich and a handwritten letter into her hands. You still have a choice, Agnes said softly. Don't waste it on bitterness. There's more to you than what they didn't give you. Hope didn't reply, but she nodded, small, uncertain, but real. At the last moment before the train pulled away, she turned and locked eyes with Blossom, who had arrived quietly behind the platform rail. They didn't wave, they didn't cry. But something passed between them in that glance, an unspoken truce, imperfect but understood. Back at home, Blossom stood at the window that night, looking out over the city lights. Angela approached from behind and laid a hand on her shoulder. You didn't lose today, she said gently. I know, Blossom replied, but it doesn't feel like winning either. Angela's grip tightened slightly. That's because you're not counting souls healed as victory. But I am. It was a warm morning when Blossom returned to the cliffside shoreline where it all began. No reporters. No official ceremony. Just the sound of waves meeting rocks and the scent of salt and redemption in the breeze. She walked slowly, her steps deliberate, a white shell cradled in her hand. Behind her, Agnes and Angela followed at a respectful distance, neither speaking. Blossom reached the edge where the sea stretched infinitely, then knelt. With trembling fingers, she placed the shell in the water's edge and whispered, This was where you ended me, and where I began again. The tide, gentle yet certain, lapped around her words as though receiving them. Agnes came to her side, aged and steadier now. When I named you Hope, I didn't know it would become prophecy, she said quietly. But I see now it was, in you, in all of us. They stood there for minutes that stretched like hours, unmoving. Angela finally stepped forward and placed a small leather pouch next to the shell. It contained the remaining pieces of the baby blanket from years ago. He tried to erase you, she said, voice low and even, but the sea returned you louder than his silence. Blossom nodded, eyes brimming but not breaking. I used to think my life was an accident. Tragedy washed ashore, but now I think it was mercy. The breeze picked up slightly, ruffling the hem of her dress. Behind them, David arrived with Nathan and Samuel, standing respectfully apart, hands folded. No one interrupted the stillness. No words chased it away. Blossom turned at last, rising slowly, and faced them. "I won't be coming back here often," she said, voice strong but reverent. "Not because I forget, but because I no longer need to remember this way." And with that, she walked forward, not from the sea, but towards something entirely new. The official launch of the new foundation wasn't marked with a gala or red carpet. Instead, it unfolded in a sunlit hall repurposed from a derelict youth center, its walls freshly painted with sea blue hues, its floors scattered with hand-sewn rugs from local women. Blossom stood behind a modest podium, wearing a navy gown and no makeup. Her voice trembled only once as she introduced the name. The sea returned her foundation. "This is not for the child I was," she said, scanning the small crowd of social workers, youth counselors, and foster alumni, "but for the many who still wait by life's shore for someone to pull them in." Behind her, a mural of a little girl in tattered clothes reaching out of crashing waves stirred murmurs. Samuel, seated in the front row, wiped a tear discreetly. Nathan, sitting beside him, handed Blossom a folded envelope after her speech. "Anonymous donation," he said with a small smile. She opened it later in private, 10 million, and a note. "Use this to open doors I used to close." The work began immediately. Nathan took charge of financial planning, helping redirect idle funds from old government partnerships. David returned to take charge of youth legal advocacy, heading a department to handle underage incarceration appeals. Samuel drafted and reviewed all foundation policies, ensuring no bureaucratic traps could ever harm the children under their protection. The very first girl brought into the foundation was a 4-year-old named Tima, found near a riverbank, silent, malnourished, clutching a plastic doll with one missing eye. Blossom knelt beside her as they admitted her. "This place is yours," she whispered. Tima didn't respond, but she leaned into her arm. Every evening, the team gathered for a 5-minute silence in front of the mural. "This isn't about us," David reminded the staff. "It's about restoring the children whose stories were almost erased." Angela sent lunch daily. Agnes stitched blankets from scraps. Every corner of Blossom's world rallied into this mission. And for the first time since her verdict speech went viral, Blossom no longer felt like a symbol of justice. She felt like its servant. The letter arrived on a gray morning in a plain envelope, unmarked, unsealed, and damp from the rain. Blossom recognized the handwriting immediately, Maxwell Cole's. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled out the letter, already yellowing at the edges. "I suppose you've won," it began. "But you should know I never meant to lose." The words were more cryptic than apologetic, stitched with bitterness and scattered remorse. He spoke of legacy, control, who couldn't father daughters without hating them. Then came the single sentence that stopped her breath. She was just a girl, and I was just a coward. No signature. No date, just silence. Nathan walked in as she reread it, eyes misty. "I got one too," he said, holding up a similar envelope. His last act was sending words we didn't need anymore. Blossom folded hers back into its sleeve. "Maybe he wanted to haunt us." Nathan shook his head. "No, he wanted forgiveness, and he didn't earn it." By noon, they met Samuel and David at the foundation courtyard. A small fire pit had been placed for an upcoming storytelling event for the children, but Blossom now bent beside it, letter in hand. "I'm not keeping it," she said. "We've lived this story. There's no reason to reread it." One by one, they added their letters, Nathan, his hands steady, David, contemplative, Samuel, unreadable. The flames crackled as the papers curled and darkened. "Some ghosts only burn when we let them," Blossom whispered. That evening, Angela brought stew and sat beside her. "Was it everything you needed to hear?" she asked. "No," Blossom replied honestly, "but it was more than I expected." Agnes didn't speak when she joined them later. She simply placed a shell on the table. The same one Blossom had thrown into the sea weeks earlier. "It washed back to shore," Agnes said. "Maybe because it's not finished." Blossom took it gently and smiled. "Neither am I. That night, no nightmares came. No huevos, no choice. Just quiet. The proposal wasn't grand. There were no flash mobs, no hidden photographers, no roses scattered in a five-star hotel. It happened in a quiet garden by the sea, a place Samuel had restored with his own hands, seed by seed. Blossom had come that evening just to sit, tired after a long meeting with the board. She didn't notice him waiting by the archway at first, holding a small ring box and wearing a soft expression that somehow held decades. "Blossom," he said, and she turned, eyes already glistening. "We've walked through darkness, together, and somehow we still bloom." Her breath caught. She didn't need him to kneel, he didn't. He opened the box and said simply, "Let's walk the rest of it in light." She covered her mouth, then laughed, then cried. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Samuel. Yes." The sea whispered behind them like it was sighing in relief. In the distance, two birds took flight, high, reckless, free. They didn't announce it for days. Not out of secrecy, but sacredness. Angela guessed immediately, shouting with joy and wrapping them both in her arms. Agnes cried in the garden, whispering to herself. She gets her beginning. David made jokes about Samuel finally catching up. Nathan, more reserved, took Samuel aside. "You waited for the right time," he said. "That's love." That evening, Blossom stared at her ring, not for its size, which was modest, but because it had her mother's birthstone at its center. "He asked for something meaningful," the jeweler had said. They planned a small ceremony, close to the sea, but far from spectacle. Blossom didn't want attention, she wanted intention. In her journal, she wrote, "There are moments when silence is the loudest celebration." The foundation team began to hum with joy. The children guessed what was coming. One of them, little Tima, tugged at Blossom's sleeve. "Are you going to be happy now?" Blossom knelt down and hugged her. "I already am." The wedding took place in a coastal chapel built from stone and driftwood, embraced by wind-blown trees and the endless roar of waves. The morning was misty, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. Blossom stood before a wooden mirror in a silk gown the color of sand after rain, her hair adorned with small white blooms. Angela gently clasped her necklace and whispered, "You've always walked this path with dignity. Today, let love walk you home." Instead of a traditional march, Blossom and Angela entered hand in hand to soft flute music played by one of the foundation children. Samuel stood at the altar, wearing a cream egbada with calm woven into every fold. He didn't smile widely. He just looked at her like he was memorizing breath itself. No father gave her away. No man stood in as a replacement. But she walked with every name that had stitched her together. After their vows, poetic and tender, shaped more by silence than words, Nathan raised his glass. His toast was short. Some families are born. Some are built. Ours was born in the fire, and we decided to stay. David, standing beside him, lifted his voice too. To the bride who became justice, and the groom who became her peace. The guests laughed gently. Agnes read an old poem about rivers that don't forget the sky. Tears blurred many eyes, especially when Samuel danced with Angela and Blossom danced with Nathan in slow, grateful sways. Later, the cake was cut with no fanfare. No media, just hands that had known labor. At dusk, Blossom and Samuel stepped outside, away from the songs. They watched the tide pull back gently from the shore. "I once thought the sea would take everything," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. But it returned the very best things instead. He wrapped his arms around her. "We'll walk into the years, Blossom. Every single one." Blossom sat behind the chief judge's desk for the first time in silence. The heavy wood was smooth under her fingers, but the weight it carried was more than carved wood. Files were stacked neatly, most from years of unresolved corruption cases swept under the rug by older judges afraid to disturb powerful names. She took a deep breath and opened the first folder. "No more delays," she whispered. Her courtroom, now hers to shape, bore no portraits of dead men. Instead, a simple framed quote behind her read, "Justice must remember the forgotten." At her inaugural address, Blossom didn't list achievements. She told a story. A baby girl was left to drown, but the tide carried her forward. Today, that girl has returned not to rule, but to serve. The silence after her words said more than applause ever could. Her reforms began immediately. Judges were required to disclose all third-party affiliations. A whistleblower network was launched with anonymous legal support provided by the Foundation's team. Interns from rural areas were invited to shadow her chambers, making space for voices often unheard. But what changed most was the atmosphere. Lawyers walked into her court aware that every word mattered, every delay was noticed. One lawyer joked, "She sees through paper like it's glass." David laughed at the comment, but admitted it wasn't far from the truth. Samuel often waited for her late into the evenings as she drafted verdicts with highlighters and soft music playing in the background. "You still try to carry too much," he would murmur, kissing her forehead. "That's why I married you." Yet Blossom felt none of it was burden. It was honor. One evening, as she stepped out of the courthouse, a young girl approached timidly. "Are you the C judge?" she asked. Blossom knelt, smiling. "I'm just Blossom. But yes, I know the C well." The girl nodded. "I want to be like you." Blossom looked into her eyes and whispered, "Then you already are." The envelope was pale yellow with no return address, resting quietly in the pile of judicial correspondence. Blossom nearly missed it until her eyes caught the name inked on the back. Hope. Her breath slowed. She opened it slowly, unsure of what the pages might say. Inside was a folded letter written in slightly shaky, handwritten cursive. It began plainly. "I don't know what I expected from you. A fight, a war. But you gave me space, and somehow that undid me more than any trial would have." The letter was not apologetic, but reflective. Hope wrote about therapy, about screaming in rooms with no answers and crying beside strangers who didn't know her name. "You were right not to argue," she wrote. "You reminded me of my humanity, even when I refused to see it." Blossom folded the page and placed it on her lap, staring out the window with tears unshed but full. In a second note enclosed within, Hope added, "I live near a hill now. It overlooks a quiet stream. I grow flowers there. I don't tell them what I've been through. They bloom anyway." The final lines struck the deepest. "I don't hate you anymore. I'm trying not to hate myself either. Thank you for giving me a place, even if I walked away from it." Blossom read it again and again. Not out of sentiment, but because it mattered that the war ended with neither of them broken. That healing had found its path, even if in silence. She didn't write back. There was nothing more to say. But she did go to the sea the next morning, stood barefoot in the foamy edge, and whispered, "Be kind to her." Samuel found her there, quietly watching. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded. Hope wrote. He didn't press. Instead, he held her hand. In that moment, the waves lapped like lullabies against their feet. The tide had brought pain, but now it returned peace, wave after wave. The nursery wasn't filled with pink or frills, but with the quiet presence of love and soft morning light. A woven cradle stood near the window, framed by cream curtains and hand-painted illustrations of the sea, a tree, and a tiny judge's gavel. Blossom knelt beside the bassinet and ran a finger along the tiny edge of the pillow, embroidered with the name, Grace Blossom Nduka. The moment had been years in the making. After months of planning, introspection, and many visits to their foundation, she and Samuel had finally found her, not chosen by numbers or profiles, but by connection. Grace had been left on the steps of a church at birth. No note, no claim. But when Blossom held her for the first time, the baby nestled into her chest and exhaled like she'd come home. That silence spoke louder than any cry. Angela was the first to visit the house after the adoption. She sat still on the couch, watching Blossom rock the child. "You are to her," she said quietly, "what I was to you." Blossom looked up, emotion clinging to her lashes. "And you're now her grandmother," she replied. Samuel entered moments later with a folded blanket. He looked at his daughter like she was a secret revealed. "You know what I thought of today?" he asked. "That the girl who was thrown away now holds a child in arms that have never dropped anything precious." They stood together near the window, watching the sleeping baby breathe gently. Later that evening, Blossom wrote Grace's name in the family Bible, not as an addition, but as a continuation. Beneath it, she penned a quiet note. "She may never know what was taken from her, but she'll grow surrounded by all that was reclaimed." Outside, the wind picked up softly, fluttering the curtains like a whisper of peace. Nathan stood in the middle of an empty building with cracked tiles, flaking walls, and echoes of long-forgotten footsteps. It had once been a youth center, abandoned for years. but where others saw ruins, he saw a beginning. "We'll knock this section down," he told David, who was walking beside him with a clipboard. "Keep the central hall. Convert these rooms into dorms. Classrooms here." David nodded, a slow smile forming. "And the name?" Nathan hesitated only a moment before answering, Second Light. It was a place he had dreamed of during his darkest nights, where boys like him, who had been twisted by fathers or misled by anger, could start again without judgment. "We're not building redemption," he said firmly. "We're giving it space to grow." Opening the center wasn't easy. Funding fell through. Permits dragged. But Nathan persisted, leveraging every connection and putting his own inheritance on the line. Blossom stood with him through the setbacks, donating legal support. Samuel coordinated volunteers. On the day of the launch, the building buzzed with energy, young men from juvenile halls, community members, mentors. Nathan walked through the halls quietly that evening after everyone had gone. He stopped in the dorm hallway, staring at a mural painted by a local artist. A tree with roots in stone and branches reaching for the sky. One of the boys had written beneath it, "Not where I came from, who I become." Nathan placed his hand on the wall and whispered, "We rise because we're willing to see the ashes." When David joined him later, carrying 2 mugs of tea, he said, "You've given them more than a bed, Nathan. You've given them a mirror that doesn't lie." Nathan smiled faintly. "And one that doesn't shatter." The chair was older than it looked, its dark wood worn smooth at the arms where Tony Obie's hands had once rested, always folded neatly after prayers or late-night talks. Blossom had it restored after his passing, not to make it new, but to preserve its stillness. It now sat in a quiet corner of her living room, flanked by a shelf of framed memories, Angela's youthful smile, Agnes holding baby Grace, Samuel and Blossom at the sea, and one faded photo of Tony grinning beside a tiny Blossom with sea salt in her curls. On quiet evenings, she sat in it not as a judge nor a mother, but as his daughter. She would talk to the chair, not for answers, but to remind herself of how far she had come. "You never wanted applause," she murmured once, "but you gave me everything worth celebrating." One night, as rain danced gently on the windows, Blossom sat with Grace cradled in her lap beside the chair. The baby fussed, restless, and Blossom hummed a lullaby Tony used to sing. The same rhythm, the same quiet cadence that once soothed a weeping child who had no idea why the world hurt. Grace's eyes fluttered closed. Angela walked in carrying tea and paused at the doorway. "He would have loved this," she said softly. "He does," Blossom replied without opening her eyes. The rain softened. They sat in silence for a while, 3 generations surrounded by memory. Before going to bed, Blossom reached for her journal and wrote, "Some legacies don't wear crowns. They wear chairs that never grow cold. And in their stillness, we remember how to love gently, lead quietly, and stay even when the storms come." Downstairs, the chair creaked just once, as if Tony had nodded. A crisp morning wind swept across the coastline, humming low against the rocks and tossing wild foam into the air. Blossom stood barefoot on the damp shore, holding Grace's tiny hand as they watched the tide move like breath. The little girl, now old enough to ask questions, turned to her mother with wide, curious eyes. "Mama, is this the sea that saved you?" Blossom knelt beside her. "It didn't save me," she said gently, "but it remembered me." Grace tilted her head. "What does that mean?" Blossom smiled, brushing hair from her daughter's face. "It means even the world knows when something precious doesn't belong to the dark." Pause. "And it helped me find my way back to the light." Grace, thoughtful, stepped forward and dropped a shell into the surf. "Then I'll give it something to remember me, too." Behind them, Samuel stood with a picnic basket and camera slung over his shoulder, watching silently. Further back on the rocks, Angela and Agnes shared a quiet moment, old wounds fading into softened memory. Agnes clutched a small framed photograph she'd brought, one of a newborn Hope, the only one she had. "She didn't come to the sea," Agnes whispered to Angela, "but part of her lives in it still." Angela rested a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe one day she will." A few yards away, Blossom held Grace up toward the sun. "Close your eyes," she whispered, "and listen to what the sea says." The wind rustled, and for a fleeting second, the child giggled. "It said your name," she exclaimed. Blossom laughed through a mist of tears. "Then it remembers." and as the waves curled around their feet, the silence between past and present folded into something eternal. The unveiling ceremony was quiet but dignified. At the heart of the new foundation site stood a polished bronze statue, a baby cloaked in a miniature judge's robe held aloft by two unseen hands, one scarred, one smooth. Etched beneath it were the words, "Return her, even if the world doesn't want her." The crowd of children, parents, survivors, and advocates stood still as Blossom stepped to the podium. Her voice, no longer trembling or angry, carried a serene strength. "This place began with pain," she said, "but pain doesn't have to be our ending. It can be the doorway through which we choose to write a different name on the world." A murmur rippled through the crowd. She continued, "We renamed the foundation today. It will now be known as Blossom's Law of Return, not because it's about me, but because it's about everything we deserve to reclaim." Later, while guests took photos and children played under new banners, Blossom walked to a small private corner of the courtyard where Samuel waited beside Judge Miriam Ayes. "She would have been proud," Miriam said, voice low with reverence. "She?" Samuel asked. Miriam nodded toward the plaque bearing the names of lost girls. "The sea didn't return only one. It returned all of them through you." Blossom swallowed hard. "I used to think my name was an accident," she said softly. "But now, I see it was a seed." Samuel reached for her hand. "And now the forest's growing." That evening, the team gathered beneath soft lights for a dinner at long wooden tables, every place set with intention. At the head sat Angela, her eyes misty but proud. When Nathan raised his glass, he said only, "To names that once shamed us, but now crown us." Everyone stood. The applause was not loud. It was reverent. It was healing. The house had become a sanctuary, not from the world, but within it. Blossom had filled it with the things she once never thought she'd have. Quiet corners with worn books, wind chimes by the windows, framed sketches Grace had made, and a faint smell of hibiscus tea that always seemed to linger. She had relinquished the bustle of headlines and turned down more interviews than she granted. Her joy had become unspoken, tucked inside early morning walks through her backyard garden, and the long, slow dinners where no one reached for a phone. "How does it feel to finally rest?" Samuel once asked, watching her recline on the porch swing, sunlight dappling her shoulders. "Like I'm no longer outrunning anything," she whispered. "Like I've finally arrived in my own life." On weekends, she and Samuel would pack a light bag, drive down coastal roads without maps, and let the day decide where they'd stop. Sometimes it was a food stall tucked between mechanics and shoe vendors. Sometimes it was an abandoned chapel overgrown with moss, where they lit candles and prayed in silence. Grace, now older, often wandered between them with endless questions and pockets full of collected leaves. One night, as they sat watching stars in the backyard, Blossom leaned into Samuel's shoulder and murmured, "We lost so much time, but look what we found instead." He turned to kiss her forehead. The time wasn't lost. It was just waiting to be filled with something worth keeping. Nearby, the wind stirred Tony's chair gently on the porch. The hush of the garden, the murmur of the trees, and the beat of her family's laughter inside the house formed a lullaby that no court, no gavel, no trauma could ever replicate. Stillness had become her finest verdict. The dining room hummed with gentle laughter, the kind that only comes when grief has finally passed and love fills the spaces it once emptied. The long table, crafted from reclaimed wood and surrounded by mismatched chairs, was covered in shared dishes, jollof rice, roasted plantains, bitter leaf soup, and fresh bread rolls from Nathan's favorite vendor. Grace, wearing an apron twice her size, danced between the plates, sneaking pieces of dodo when she thought no one was looking. At the head sat Angela, her silver scarf pinned with a brooch shaped like a sea turtle. Next to her, Agnes poured palm wine with shaky but content hands, while David narrated a hilarious story about his disastrous first case back in Lagos. The sound of a spoon tapping a glass called the room to attention. Blossom stood slowly, her smile unforced, her eyes glistening. "I once believed family was something that came from blood," she began, voice even and warm. "But I was wrong. It comes from choice. It comes from who stood beside you when you were sinking." She turned to Nathan. "You could have walked away again, but you stayed." She nodded to Agnes. "You were broken, but you came back with truth." Her voice caught slightly as she looked at Angela. "And you, every time I needed a hand, you were already reaching." Grace tugged at her gown and whispered, "Say Daddy too." The room chuckled. Blossom touched Samuel's arm. "And you waited until I was ready to be loved." The guests stood and raised their glasses. No toasts were needed, just presence. As food was passed, music played softly in the background, an old jazz tune Tony used to hum while fixing light bulbs. "He's here," Angela whispered. Blossom nodded. "Everywhere." That night, after the guests had gone and the candles flickered low, Blossom sat alone on the porch, one hand resting on Grace's drawing of the dinner table. The faces were childish sketches, uneven and bright, but they were all there, whole, unbroken, together. The memoir arrived quietly on bookstore shelves, no banners, no launch parties. The sea returned her, appeared like a tide, gentle but certain. On the cover was a blurred photo of the coastline taken at dusk, a silhouette of a woman standing where land met waves. Inside, the story unraveled in slow, deliberate chapters. A baby discarded, a stranger's arms, a robe, a gavel, a name reclaimed. But it wasn't just Blossom's voice that filled the pages. Each chapter began with quotes from those who walked beside her. A journal entry from Agnes, a recorded interview with Angela, an excerpt from Samuel's vows, even a brief, posthumous letter from Tony. Every voice echoed with one refrain: "Pain may name us, but love is what completes the story." Reviews trickled in, quiet, respectful. A New York critic wrote, "This isn't a book. It's a resurrection." On a quiet morning months later, Blossom stood once more at the very same shoreline that once bore her legend. The air was clearer now. Her reflection in the water no longer looked lost. It looked home. Grace ran circles near the edge, shouting, "Mama! The sea is whispering again." Blossom chuckled. "Ask it what it remembers." The child squinted at the waves, then shouted, "It said you're not finished yet." Behind her, Samuel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "She's right, you know," he murmured. "Your voice has only just begun." Blossom looked out across the endless blue, wind lifting the hem of her dress. Then slowly, purposefully, she reached into her satchel and pulled out the final page of her memoir. With trembling hands, she placed it in a glass bottle, sealed it with wax, and set it adrift. As it bobbed into the horizon, she whispered the last words to the wind. "He threw me away, but the sea carried me home." The waves accepted the offering, and the morning sun rose higher. Behind her, the laughter of her daughter rang clear, and the legacy of survival gave way to peace. Not a victory, not a headline, but something greater: wholeness. In this time, nothing and no one would take it from her. Here's the Bible verse, Isaiah 43, verses 1 and 2. This verse aligns deeply with Blossom's journey from abandonment to restoration. It echoes how God's unseen hand protected her through trauma, how identity once drowned was reclaimed, and how love, divine and human, ultimately triumphed over generational wounds. Moral of the story. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.